This man's body suddenly shrank proportionally due to an accident. His pet cat at home even mistook him for food. The man accidentally fell into the basement. Only a blood-stained piece of clothing was left in the living room. When his wife came back, she thought her husband had been eaten by the cat.
Elise, je suis là! Elise, je suis là!
The once familiar basement has become full of dangers. A tiny spider could even cost him his life. Can the man escape this little basement and get back to his family? Let's start this wonderful journey right away. The leading actor Paul is an ordinary operator of a shipbuilding company. He lives a pretty plain and ordinary life, keeping his business running, and spending time with his wife Elise and daughter Mia. Family and work formed the whole focus of his life. Just when Paul thought life would go on like this, an accident came unexpectedly. On this day, Paul went swimming at the beach as usual, but the clouds above his head strangely formed a vortex. The seawater also kept fluctuating. He didn't take this matter to heart and went to and from work as usual, handling all kinds of trivial matters at home. But after one night, Paul found that all his shirts no longer fit. He simply took out yesterday's clothes from the laundry basket and planned to make do with them for another day. Unexpectedly, yesterday's clothes were also a lot bigger. You can't suddenly shrink a whole size in just one day, even if you lose weight. But Paul still had a lot of things to deal with at the company. There was no time to think about it carefully, and he dragged his tired body to dinner in the evening. He coaxed his daughter to bed as usual. In the blink of an eye, a few more days passed. All the clothes in the wardrobe were ridiculously long. Paul realized that something was wrong. If it was just simple weight loss, the clothes would only become loose, not long. He didn't dare to delay and hurried to the hospital for a full body checkup. Only then did he find that his height had actually shrunk from 1.8 meters to 1.76 meters. The doctor examined the test report carefully and found nothing wrong with it. Besides, the last time Paul had his height measured was when he served in the military 15 years ago. It's normal to shrink a little as you get older. Although 4 centimeters is a bit much, there's no need to be nervous. Since the doctor said so, Paul had to let it go. But he was always uneasy in his heart. He couldn't fall asleep, so he simply got up to exercise in the middle of the night. 10 days later, Paul got up to take a shower. He clearly felt that he was getting farther and farther away from the shower head. Even his wedding ring suddenly slipped off his ring finger. He quickly put on his bathrobe and walked out. This time, even his wife Elise noticed something unusual. Her husband, who was a head taller than her on usual days, was now almost the same height as her, even a few centimeters shorter. Elise immediately put down all her work and accompanied her husband to the hospital for another checkup. They went through a whole set of procedures including X-rays, CT scans and brain MRI. Medical experts and endocrinologists tried all means but couldn't find out the cause of the disease. They were even unable to stop this process. Paul had shrunk 15 centimeters in just a few weeks. His weight also dropped by nearly 10 kilograms. But his metabolism and all organs were perfectly normal, with no problems at all. The doctor asked Paul if he had accidentally been exposed to any toxic substances these days, such as chemical fertilizers, chemical solvents or other unknown substances, or if anything strange had happened recently. Emotional blows, traumatic events, any abnormal external or internal factors are worth studying. After all, the human body is very miraculous. But Paul's daily life was ordinary and monotonous, and there was no possibility of him being exposed to harmful substances. As for the strange weather at the beach that time, Paul had long forgotten about it. He didn't think of it at all. In the days that followed, Paul could only wait patiently for the doctor's research results. Unluckily, there was only disappointment day after day, watching Paul's body shrink more and more. Soon even the pet cat was far bigger than him. To avoid causing panic among the people around, Paul hadn't left the house at all during this time. One day, he suddenly heard the voices of strangers and hurried to hide under the bed in the bedroom. Then a real estate agent brought customers in to view the house. But Paul knew nothing about this. He had no idea that his wife planned to sell their home. Paul hid under the bed and eavesdropped on the agent talking to others. He learned that Elise had told others that her husband was missing. She wanted to sell the house because it held too many memories.
Ils auraient pu me voir, Elise! Qu'est-ce qui te prend? J'existe plus! Déjà la vente de la maison! On aurait pu en discuter, non?
Paul had every reason to be so angry. Every brick and tile of this house was built by his own hands, and it was of extraordinary significance. Elise certainly knew this, but Paul couldn't resume his daily work. She couldn't afford the family expenses alone, so Elise planned to sell the house and move to a smaller place to live. To be honest, she had no idea what to do either. Because Paul had refused to receive treatment since a few months ago, and he wasn't willing to go to the hospital anymore.
J'ai pas envie de finir comme un rat de laboratoire. Je suis pas malade. Je suis peut-être pas le seul d'ailleurs.
Pardon.
Mia heard her parents arguing and couldn't help coming out to peek. She was too young to know how to face her father as he was now. But another month passed, and Mia finally accepted the fact. She even built a small house made of cardboard for her father. To be precise, this small house was originally prepared for a doll. It had a kitchen and a bedroom inside. Paul took the doll on the bed and danced to the music. He wanted to cheer up his downcast daughter.
Qu'est-ce qu'il y a, Mia? Tu veux jouer à autre chose?
Oh monstre! Oh monstre!
The girl finally came to her senses. Her father was no longer the towering and reliable adult, but a fragile being who needed protection. This inverted change of identity made the relationship between Paul and his family more and more distant. Late at night, he came to the bedroom and looked at his wife lying alone in bed. Elise seemed to sense something, opened her eyes immediately, and reached out her hand to her lonely husband. Days like this passed one by one. To keep himself from being too bored, Paul often tinkered with some tiny inventions. Unexpectedly, a crash suddenly came from behind the pet door. Then the pet cat slipped into the house. Paul pulled out the iron hook that had pierced his side. He found a big gash on his waist and abdomen. He quickly took off his clothes to check the wound, but the smell of blood soon caught the cat's attention. Paul grabbed a sewing needle to defend himself and turned to run to another room. His running only made the pet cat even more excited. In the nick of time, Paul slid and ducked into a crack in the door. When Paul regained consciousness, he found that he had fallen into a clutter box in the basement. Soon after, Elise and her daughter returned home and only saw the blood-stained clothes on the floor. She was very anxious because she couldn't find Paul anywhere. She hurried down to the basement to check. When Paul saw his wife, he waved and shouted desperately from below, but the noise was no louder than a mosquito's buzz. Elise didn't hear a thing. Instead, the cat was the first to spot Paul in the clutter box. It stared at its prey with big eyes. Paul tried to call the cat over. Maybe it would catch his wife's attention.
C'est toi qui as fait ça. C'est pas possible. Pourquoi t'as fait ça?
And this led to a huge misunderstanding. Elise thought the black and white cat had eaten her husband, and Paul was completely trapped in the basement. No one could hear him no matter how he howled. As for Paul now, not to mention escaping the basement, it was even hard for him to get out of this clutter box. Time ticked by. Every minute felt as long as a century. He was half naked and freezing to death. He could only rummage around in the clutter box, and managed to find a tattered piece of cloth with great difficulty. Paul slung the cloth strip over a nail and tore it to pieces, and barely made a set of clothes for himself. Just then he noticed a piece of cardboard on one side of the box. Paul squeezed into the gap and was pleasantly surprised to find a hole in the clutter box. He climbed out of the box successfully and picked up the sewing needle on the ground. The once narrow basement seemed so vast and spacious, and insects scurried past from time to time. This made Paul realize that the basement wasn't a safe place. He clenched the sewing needle and climbed up to a higher place. When Paul climbed up, he found that a water tank was right above his head. The screws here were loose, and water dripped down from time to time, which could just solve his problems of thirst and washing. Soon, his first night in the basement was over. Sunlight slipped in through the window slowly. Paul had just regained consciousness when he heard his daughter's voice, so he rushed to the door to cry for help. But the stone steps in front of him made people dizzy. The height that he could step over with a single lift of his leg before was now unattainable. There was only deep despair in Paul's heart. If things went on like this, he would surely die here. Paul looked around and found a few broken pieces of chalk. He hastily held the chalk with both hands and wrote on the ground. After writing just a few letters, Paul was sweating profusely from exhaustion. He prayed that if his wife could come in, she would see the message he left at a glance. As time went by, Paul had to find a way to solve his lunch problem. Luckily, he found a mousetrap with a big piece of cheese on it. Paul used the sewing needle to drive away the ants on it, and then found 2 iron nails nearby. It turned out that he wanted to use the nails to disable the trigger. But if he made a mistake in the operation, Paul's arm would be crushed on the spot. Paul triggered the mousetrap successfully. He broke off a piece of cheese and devoured it greedily, not caring whether it had been gnawed by bugs or not. Just then a spider quietly lowered itself down on its web and approached. Paul immediately picked up the sewing needle and waved it constantly to deter the spider. Luckily, the big spider didn't keep approaching. Paul was really regretful now, back when he hadn't shrunk yet. His daughter, being afraid of spiders, had asked him to kill the bug. But Paul hadn't removed the spider web and even told Mia that spiders were very useful. They would eat pests like mosquitoes and flies. Paul never thought that he would become a spider's prey one day. Instead of waiting for death, he took the iron nail and approached the cardboard box, trying to poke a hole in the hard cardboard. But he was too weak. The clever Paul came up with an idea. All paper products turn soft when they get wet, so he rummaged out a bottle cap from the clutter box, then filled it with water and soaked the rags, softening the hard cardboard bit by bit, and then continued to poke it with the iron nail, repeating this process countless times. He finally dug a hole in the cardboard box. Paul climbed in at once. There was little clutter in the box. It was basically full of unused books and stationery. He found an eraser and mended the hole he had just dug. He finally had a relatively safe place to rest. Paul slept through the night without any dreams, got up early and continued to nibble on the remaining cheese. July 15th. Paul had been staying in the basement for some time. On this day, he suddenly heard a long-awaited sound at the door and hurried over to cry for help. He hit the paper clip with the iron nail, trying to make a louder noise to attract attention. The heavy door closed mercilessly all the same. Elise didn't spot her desperate husband. Paul squatted on the ground in dejection. Beneath the survival crisis was his profound reflection on himself and life. When human beings lose their physical strength, does the value of life depend on external forms? He was trapped in a battle that was doomed to failure and had to survive by instinct like an animal. If he was going to act like an animal, he should stop thinking altogether. Paul forced himself not to think too deeply, otherwise he would lose the will to live. There was a wine rack in the basement, although most of the wine bottles were high up. Luckily, there was one bottle on the bottom shelf. Paul pried open a crack with great effort and caught the flowing wine in a container. Facts have proven that drinking on an empty stomach is harmful to the body. The drunk Paul struggled to his feet and stared at the spider from a distance. Alcohol made him forget his fear. Paul climbed onto the fish tank with the sewing needle in his hand. The spider vanished in the blink of an eye, just when Paul thought he had scared the enemy away. He struggled to swim to the surface, only to find the spider still lying in wait above him. Paul had to hold his breath and dive back into the water. The scene was truly dreamy and beautiful, and it also raised a question. Had no one come to feed the goldfish that had been in the basement for so long? In the end, it was Paul who picked up the fish food nearby and fed the goldfish. Starving, he couldn't help taking a bite of the fish food too, but he spat it out immediately the next second. This stuff was really not meant for humans to eat. After nightfall, there were thunder and lightning outside. Paul was about to go fetch fresh water when he sensed the huge spider staring at him in the dark. This would be a battle for survival. Paul immediately pulled out the sewing needle, tensed every muscle in his body and waved the weapon desperately. The spider hesitated to advance, frightened by the needle point. Paul took the chance and ran into the dark, but the big spider soon stretched out its body. He stabbed the spider a few times with the sewing needle. The next second, the spider crawled down the pillar and drove the poor Paul to a dead end. In the nick of time, Paul grabbed a broken wooden splinter beside him and stabbed the spider. He stabbed it dozens of times in a row. The spider finally retreated to the side. Paul finally won this thrilling battle. He dragged out a big ball of broken cardboard, and then pulled a matchbox out of the box. Paul hugged the matches and sprinted as hard as he could, and managed to strike a spark on the sandpaper with great difficulty. He immediately set the cardboard on the ground on fire. A man and a doll stared at the fire together. Since ancient times, fire has been of great significance to human civilization. It can bring light and warmth, and dispel cold and hunger. Perhaps this is why Paul lit the fire. He needed warmth, and he also needed hope. Unluckily, there was no alarm in this basement. Otherwise, taking the risk to start a big fire might have caught the attention of his wife Elise. 5 more days passed in the blink of an eye. Paul had very little dry food left. His body had shrunk a little more, so he had to tear off a section of his trouser leg to make himself a new set of clothes. Just then, a sound came from the basement door again. Paul hurried over in a dash, waved his arms and shouted for help loudly. but it was a strange man in a suit who walked in. He was talking on the phone as he walked. The shrunken Paul couldn't stand the noise made by the man, and could only hide aside in pain and cover his ears. He didn't know how much time had passed, and the ear-piercing noise finally disappeared. When Paul came out to check, the man was long gone, and even the goldfish in the fish tank was gone with him. I guess the man in the suit just now was most likely a real estate agent. I'm afraid this house has been officially sold. Even if Paul leaves the basement, he may not be able to see his wife and daughter. Several months later, Paul's body had become even smaller than a mosquito. Even mosquitoes were too lazy to suck his blood. When they saw him, Paul noticed that the screen window in the basement couldn't trap mosquitoes. In other words, as long as he could climb up, he could also pass through the mesh and leave this prison. But it was far from easy to climb this wall. The quick-witted Paul didn't start with the smooth wall surface, but turned and climbed towards a huge wooden shelf beside it. There were many uneven grains on the wood, which could serve as footholds for him to climb. It's true that extreme adversity can arouse infinite potential in people. Paul climbed until the sun was about to set and finally reached the top. He sat on the high place and rested for a while, then began to figure out a way to get close to the window. There was still a long distance between the wooden shelf and the wall. The only way for the moment was to jump over it, and Paul had nothing left to fear. Unexpectedly, he made it. Paul walked slowly towards the window along the stone wall. Unexpectedly, a lot of intricate spider webs appeared ahead. In order not to wake the sleeping spiders, he could only carefully bypass the spider silk and move forward. But spiders are such sensitive creatures, and they soon spotted the uninvited guest at the door. They crawled to Paul's side in the blink of an eye. The huge spider was like a tank, and one of its legs could crush him to death easily. Paul lost control of his bladder under such pressure, and could almost feel the breath of death approaching. Unexpectedly, a small insect was suddenly caught in the spider web at this point. The big spider hesitated for a moment, and then decided to eat the more familiar food. Paul narrowly escaped with his life, his whole body weak, and rushed to the windowsill.
Avoir regardé la mort dans les yeux est une chance. Elle rend au monde sa beauté originelle. Celle qu'on ne voyait plus. On dit que vivre, c'est apprendre à mourir. Peut-être faudrait-il mourir pour apprendre à vivre.
Paul tried to get through the mesh of the screen window, but found himself stuck halfway, although the mosquito he saw before was bigger than him. It was an insect, with a skeleton different from that of vertebrates. Paul tried for a long time to no avail, and finally fell asleep from exhaustion. When he regained consciousness, he found a big ant trying to bite his calf. What was even more terrifying was that the big spider was also hunting nearby. Its pitch-black simple eye fixed on Paul in an instant. Scared out of his wits, he scrambled out of the wire mesh. Luckily, Paul had shrunk a little more after the night. Otherwise he would surely have become the spider's breakfast this morning. The spider couldn't get through the mesh and had to give up. Night gradually fell. It was the first time Paul realized that the night world could be so lively. All kinds of insect chirps filled his ears. He approached a huge dewdrop on the ground and caught a glimpse of a moth's reflection flitting across it. The beautiful insect flapped its wings constantly, stirring up gusts of gentle wind blowing towards him.
Il m'aura fallu tout ce chemin pour me retrouver. Sortir de ma cage. Me libérer de la peur. Notre vie est passagère. Une goutte dans l'océan. Une poussière sur un caillou. Infime et magnifique. Alors voilà, Mia. J'aurais voulu te dire tout ça. Te faire gagner le temps que j'ai perdu.
Although Paul didn't know if he would ever see Mia again, they would always be under the same starry sky. The film The Shrinking Man is a fable about existence, a grand proposition set in the micro-world. The story doesn't stop at the visual spectacle of an adventure in Lilliput, but retells, from a highly contemporary perspective, the content in Richard Matheson's original novel The Shrinking Man, the eternal existential questions about existentialism. In fact, long before the release of this new adaptation, the story was first brought to the big screen in 1957 under the name The Incredible Shrinking Man. Unlike the original version, which focuses on the existential fear of the atomic age, the new adaptation focuses more on exploring self-identification. The director uses the physical shrinking to force the spiritual expansion, letting the audience re-examine the essence of human nature and the value of life in the thrilling survival narrative. When our external labels are stripped away, what exactly is the remaining self? The leading actor Jean Dujardin portrays Paul's psychological transformation incisively and vividly with his exquisite performance. The collapse and helplessness in the early days when facing the physical mutation, the instinctive struggle for survival in the basement, and the final relief realized in the desperate situation when the world is magnified. Those details that were once ignored truly highlight their importance. Everything is just as Paul's final insight goes. Perhaps one can only learn how to live after dying once. This film is not only a novel micro-adventure, but also a reflection on self and life, which is worthy of careful appreciation.